The fluorescent lights of JFK Airport buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow over the polished floors. The terminal pulsed with movement, pilots and flight attendants weaving between hurried travelers, their crisp uniforms blending seamlessly into the controlled chaos of international travel. Ava Carter walked with quiet authority, her 4 gold stripes gleaming against her immaculate navy jacket. At 38 years old, with over 15,000 flight hours and a distinguished career in the U.S. Air Force, she had commanded aircraft over war zones and navigated through storms most pilots would never dare face. Yet today, her biggest battle wasn't in the skies. It was here. She reached the crew briefing room, gripping her flight manual. Her name was on the schedule. Captain Ava Carter, commanding Orion Airways Flight 227, a Boeing 777X, bound for London. But as she stepped inside, a sharp voice stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me." Richard Moore barely glanced up from his clipboard, his smirk edged with something colder. "We don't allow trainee pilots to captain international flights. You'll need to wait outside." Silence settled. A few pilots exchanged looks. Someone chuckled. Ava didn't blink. She had seen this coming, and they had no idea what was coming next. Ava Carter stepped through the doorway of the Orion Airways crew lounge, her presence cutting through the steady hum of pre-flight preparations. Conversation slowed, eyes flickered, and in an instant, she felt the shift. The kind of unspoken tension that came from walking into a room where she wasn't expected, where she wasn't wanted. Her tailored navy blue uniform jacket fit perfectly, the 4 gold stripes on her sleeves gleaming under the fluorescent lighting. At 38 years old, she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from 15,000 hours in the cockpit, from missions that had tested every ounce of her skill. Yet, despite her record, despite the sweat and sacrifice that had brought her here, she could feel the weight of doubt hanging in the air. A pilot near the coffee station gave a quiet chuckle, just loud enough to be heard. "You seeing this?" he muttered to his colleague, jerking his chin in Ava's direction. "They've really outdone themselves this time." His companion smirked. "A 777X? What's next, a flight attendant in the captain's seat?" Someone stifled a laugh. Another pilot shifted uncomfortably, not joining in but not stopping it either. Ava caught the words, let them land, but gave no reaction. She had heard worse. She walked further in, her boots clicking sharply against the polished floor. Some of them recognized her. She saw it in their cautious glances, the way their expressions tightened as they registered her name embroidered on her uniform. Others didn't know her yet, but they knew what they thought she was. A woman, a black woman, a captain who, in their eyes, shouldn't be one. She ignored them. She had walked into rooms like this before, in military briefings, in training simulations, in flight schools where she had to prove herself twice as much for half the respect. A young first officer, no older than 30, leaned toward his colleague, his voice low but intentional. "She thinks she's about to fly a 777X?" He shook his head, feigning sympathy. "Someone should wake her up before she embarrasses herself." Ava turned, her gaze settling on him like a blade pressed against glass, controlled, unwavering. The young officer faltered, his smirk flickering just slightly, but he didn't look away. She didn't either. Then, without a word, she strode past them, straight toward the briefing room where her name was already printed on the flight roster. Let them talk. She had a job to do. The briefing room was a low hum of quiet conversations and the occasional tap of fingers against tablets. The digital display refreshed, listing the crew assignments for the day. Ava Carter's name was exactly where it should be. Captain, Orion Airways. Flight 227, Boeing 777X, London Heathrow. She had studied the flight plan, anticipated the weather patterns, run through every variable. This was her flight. The door swung open sharply. Tom Barrett entered, tablet in hand, his expression impassive. The room fell silent as every pilot instinctively straightened in their seats. He didn't sit. Instead, he stopped at the head of the table, glanced at his screen, and spoke with his usual directness. "We have an update regarding Flight 227. Ava remained still, listening. Barrett looked at his tablet once more before delivering the news. "We've reassigned the flight. Captain Whitmore will take command." The words landed with the finality of an order no one could refuse. A beat. A slow, heavy shift in the atmosphere. Ava set her pen down, her movements deliberate, precise. "I was scheduled to captain this flight," she said, her voice even. "Why the change?" Barrett didn't look at her. "Operational reasons." A vague excuse. She wasn't about to let it slide. "Be specific." Barrett finally glanced up, just for a moment. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, though he masked it quickly. "Experience." Ava's expression remained unreadable, but her muscles tensed beneath the surface. "I have over 15,000 flight hours." Her voice was steady. "I've commanded international routes. I've trained captains who fly for Orion today." She leaned forward, her gaze locked onto his. "What experience am I missing?" Silence. A few pilots shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided eye contact. No one spoke. Barrett's smile was thin, measured. "It's not just about hours, Captain Carter." He let the pause settle, drawing it out just long enough for the weight of his words to land. "It's about fitting Orion's standards." The turbulence hit. Ava didn't need a translation. They all knew what he meant. She let the silence stretch, but her mind was already calculating. A fight here wouldn't change their minds. It would only feed their expectations, give them the outburst they were waiting for. She inhaled slowly, controlling the steady rise and fall of her breath. Then, a single nod. Understood. She reached for her flight manual, snapped it shut. Barrett moved on, satisfied. Ava didn't react. Not yet. She knew what was coming next, and she was ready. The crew assignment board had changed, and the difference felt like a challenge hurled right at her. Ava Carter stood before it, noting the absence of her own name alongside Orion Airways. Flight 227, Boeing 777X, London Heathrow. Instead, she'd been reassigned to Flight 319, an unremarkable domestic hop to Atlanta. Not as captain, as an observer. A slight tension coiled in her shoulders. She ran her gaze down the roster until it landed on Captain Eric Dawson, a pilot who, until now, had fewer flight hours than she had combat missions. Dawson had only 4 years with Orion, while Ava had dedicated more than a decade of civilian and military aviation. Yet somehow, he was deemed more suited to command than she was. Ava inhaled slowly, letting the reality of it settle. She didn't let her anger show, though a flicker of heat sparked behind her eyes. From the other side of the lounge, she heard soft laughter. The buzz of conversation had dipped into that furtive hush she knew too well, like a group that wanted to be heard only enough to insult, but not enough to confront her directly. She stood still, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. "Well, look at that." The voice was lazy, confident. Ava recognized it as Greg Phillips, a senior first officer, who liked to talk big about his imminent promotion. She hadn't realized he also specialized in cheap shots. She didn't turn, not yet. "Guess some people just aren't cut out to lead, huh?" Someone else chimed in, adding fuel to the derision. A subdued laugh rippled across the room. Another pilot mumbled something under his breath, prompting a few smirks. Then, just loud enough for her to catch every syllable, "Maybe she can grab coffee for us instead." That line drew louder snickers, a few heads turning to gauge her reaction. Ava exhaled slowly, measured and controlled, the way she would steady her breathing before a tricky landing. She turned around, facing them directly. Her expression was calm, almost too calm. Greg leaned against the coffee station, arms crossed, an amused grin tugging at his lips. He didn't look away, as though testing her, waiting for some outburst or protest. Ava walked closer, holding his stare. For a moment, no one else in the room existed. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but cutting. "Would you like sugar with that?" The smirk on Greg's face faltered. A pilot nearby coughed to hide a half-nervous, half-amused chuckle. Another glanced down at his flight manual, suddenly absorbed in meaningless data. Ava maintained eye contact. She didn't need to add anything else. The silence said enough. Greg shifted his stance, scoffing under his breath, but it was clear he'd lost the tiny showdown. He looked away first, muttering something inaudible. Ava turned back toward the board. This so-called reassignment was clearly a demotion, an attempt to undermine her authority. They believed it would sideline her. They couldn't have been more wrong. They thought this was a setback. They had no idea this was just the beginning. Ava's new observer assignment left her more time than usual between flights, which she used to familiarize herself with Orion Airways' technical procedures. Early that morning, she lingered in an administrative corridor near the maintenance offices, scanning digital logs displayed on a secured terminal. Most details seemed routine: fuel checks, cabin pressure tests, engine calibrations. But then, she saw a line item that made her pause. Boeing 777X. Maintenance Deviation Report. Her interest piqued. Ava navigated deeper into the file. It listed a series of anomalies flagged on a Boeing 777X, scheduled for an international flight, later in the week. The recommended action cited immediate inspection of certain structural components. However, next to that recommendation, a single note read, "Approved to fly without delay. Cost concerns." Her eyes narrowed. A fleeting sense of unease took root. She double-checked the timestamps. The official review was only 12 hours old, yet the plane had already been cleared for operation without further checks. It was a clear violation of standard protocol. In her previous airline roles, something like this would trigger immediate grounding, or at least a thorough inspection. She scrolled through additional documents, engine performance summaries, fuselage stress test results. Multiple lines contradicted the green light given. The system, it seemed, had flagged the same problem thrice. Each time, an override was performed. She recognized signatures belonging to higher-level maintenance managers, people who had likely never flown a plane themselves, but had the authority to sidestep warnings if it saved Orion money. As she stood there, the distant clang of tools and the faint smell of machine oil reminded her of the raw stakes. If a Boeing 777X wasn't structurally sound, hundreds of lives were at risk. Yet cost concerns were apparently paramount. Ava scrolled further until a sudden ping jolted her. The access window expired, the screen reverting to a login prompt. She stepped back, unsettled. This wasn't a glitch. Someone had set the system to auto-log out quickly, perhaps to deter prying eyes. Her gut churned. This was more than a simple oversight or a rushed decision. It smelled of a systematic disregard for safety, to keep planes in the air and revenues flowing. She took a shaky breath, her mind already flipping through every regulation she knew, every moral line that shouldn't be crossed. She couldn't ignore it. This was bigger than a single flight. It was a glimpse into how Orion cut corners. And if they were doing it with one aircraft, how many others had been silently waved through? Before she could gather more evidence, footsteps echoed from behind the half-open door. She froze, quickly stepping away from the terminal. Her breath caught as the footsteps drew closer. She glanced at the locked screen, cursing under her breath. This wasn't a small oversight. It was a gamble with hundreds of lives. She slipped behind a nearby cabinet, heart pounding, Discovery now would ruin everything. She needed evidence, fast. No time to hesitate. Her instincts warned there was more at stake than she thought. Marcus Jefferson was waiting near the far end of the maintenance hangar when Ava arrived. Rows of Orion Airways jets lined the concrete floor, their fuselages gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. She spotted him leaning against a tool chest, arms folded, gaze flicking around warily. Their meeting wasn't on any schedule, just two people risking their careers. Ava approached with her heart pounding. Marcus was a senior engineer with 15 years at Orion, and rumor said he once tried to expose sloppy maintenance checks, but went silent after an accident befell a colleague. He beckoned her closer, voice low. "I heard you've been asking questions. That's risky around here. They don't like anyone digging into maintenance logs." Ava held his stare. "I found a suspicious override on a 777X. The system flagged it 3 times, but each time it was cleared without explanation." Marcus exhaled, tension etched across his features. "Yeah, I've seen worse. Paperwork that doesn't match actual repairs. Engines with questionable cycles. But it goes deeper." He paused, scanning the hangar. "We had a guy named Simon. He tried to file a complaint. 1 week later he fell from a rig, broke his spine, walked away with a settlement and a gag order." Ava's stomach tightened. "They silenced him." Marcus nodded, his eyes flicking around as a mechanic passed by. "He was careful. Never took unnecessary risks. That accident was too convenient." She glanced at the planes looming above them, metal giants that relied on precise checks and honest logs. "I won't let Orion gamble with people's lives," she said. Marcus handed her a small flash drive. "This has partial records, overrides, missing signatures, change dates. It's not everything, but it shows a pattern." Ava's grip on the drive tightened. "Thanks. I'll keep this safe," he shrugged. "Be careful. You think they're just ignoring protocol. They're willing to go further." She slipped the drive into her pocket, mind racing with possibilities. If Orion's management had brushed off flagged maintenance logs, how far would they go to hide systemic negligence? The thought of a plane going down because of corporate greed made her blood simmer. She took one last look at Marcus. "I owe you." He gave a curt nod. "Just don't get caught." With that, he disappeared into the rows of tool carts, leaving Ava alone amid the faint hum of hydraulic lifts. She exhaled, scanning the cavernous hangar. This wasn't about her career anymore. It was about every passenger who trusted Orion's name. She glanced at the drive once more, then headed for the exit, determined to expose whatever lay beneath this glossy exterior. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was tinted with the first hints of morning light. Ava paused by a cargo loading area, her heart still pounding from the conversation. She glanced around to ensure no one was following. If Marcus was right, then Simon's accident was one warning sign among many. She clutched the flash drive tighter, vowing not to become Orion's next casualty. Inside Orion's executive suite, Tom Barrett convened a closed-door meeting with a handful of trusted allies. The walls were thick, soundproof, ensuring no stray conversation escaped. A digital clock on the wall blinked a bright 7:12 a.m., but none of them looked at it. All eyes were on Barrett. He pressed a remote, projecting an internal memo on the large screen. "We have a problem," he said bluntly. "Ava Carter's been poking around maintenance logs and collecting data. We suspect she's already approached at least one technician." Richard Moore, arms folded across his chest, let out a low grunt. "I told you we should have handled this sooner. She's trouble, straight from the moment she insisted on that international route." Barrett ignored the remark and continued. "She's an observer now, but that doesn't mean she's idle. She has more access than we like. If she compiles enough evidence, we could be facing an FAA inquiry or worse." A younger executive, lips tight with nerves, glanced at the memo. "So, What's our move? Barrett's gaze hardened. We neutralize the threat. I've arranged for IT to monitor her emails. Any documents she sends or receives, deleted. Any communication about 777X issues, erased. Moore nodded. And if she tries to go public? Barrett's voice was cold. She'll have nothing to show. No proof, no leverage. She's an outsider, barely proven. We'll spin it as pilot overreaction. They all nodded in grim agreement, the atmosphere thick with an unspoken understanding. They would do whatever it took to protect Orion's bottom line. Elsewhere, in a cramped office near the training simulator, Ava was typing an email to a former colleague she trusted at the FAA. She attached a portion of the flash drive's data, her pulse pounding at the risk. Midway through hitting send, an error message flashed across her screen. Access denied. Then the monitor went dark. Heart hammering, she tried to reboot. The computer refused to respond. A shrill beep signaled an internal lockout. Her phone buzzed. A cryptic message from James Lee. They're on to you. Shut everything down. Now. She gritted her teeth, adrenaline surging. This was exactly what she feared. They were hacking her account, scouring her system, trying to wipe any evidence. But Ava had anticipated this. She yanked a slim external drive from her bag, the real goldmine of data copied and encrypted under multiple layers of security. Let them wipe the local files. She had backups, each stashed on cloud servers beyond their reach. Feet pounded in the hallway outside. She heard muffled voices, an urgent scramble. Barrett was moving fast. She closed her laptop, heart drumming a frantic beat. They might cut her off from the network, revoke her ID, try to corner her. But they couldn't erase what she'd already sent, nor the safeties she'd put in place. With a swift, controlled breath, Ava stood. They thought they were one step ahead. They had no idea she was 3 steps beyond. Taking a discreet route through the back corridors of Orion Airways headquarters, Ava found Marcus Jefferson waiting in a dimly lit maintenance alcove. He stood beside a half-disassembled turbine compressor, his uniform stained with traces of engine grease. She shut the door quietly behind her, aware that prying eyes might lurk around every corner. Marcus glanced up, relief crossing his features. "I didn't think you'd come this way," he muttered, keeping his voice low. "Too many security cameras by the main hangar," Ava nodded. "I can't risk them seeing us together too often." She gestured at the pieces of machinery laid out on a metal table. "You said you had more information." He lifted a battered folder, edges curling from repeated handling. "They've been cutting corners on multiple Boeing 777X planes, not just the one you found. This is the stuff we never put into the official system. Paper records. Old-fashioned, but harder to delete with a keystroke." Ava flipped through the folder, spotting unscheduled component swaps, unexplained override notes, and signatures she didn't recognize. "It's all flagged as minor repairs," she remarked, frowning at the mismatch in dates. "But these look major," Marcus nodded grimly. "They are. We had an incident a month ago. Fuel line stress cracks on 2 separate aircraft. The logs show repaired, but trust me, they never did the full fix." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Our supervisors told us to patch it just enough for the next flight. Every time I tried to push for a real fix, I got shut down." Ava's gaze hardened. "So it's official policy to ignore major safety issues to keep flights on schedule?" He swallowed. "Unofficial, but yes. If an aircraft is grounded, Orion loses money. They'll do anything to avoid that." She closed the folder carefully, tucking it into her own worn-out messenger bag. "What about the employee you mentioned before? The one who fell, after raising concerns?" Marcus glanced around, checking the hallway. "His name was Richard Phelps. Good mechanic, always by the book. He noticed structural fatigue on a landing gear assembly and reported it. A week later, he tripped off a scaffolding platform, ended up with a broken hip and a hefty settlement. NDA sealed his lips. He exhaled shakily. We got the message. Ava felt her anger spike. This wasn't just negligence, it was a pattern. Have you told anyone else? Marcus shook his head. No one who could do anything. But I can't stay quiet forever. People's lives are at stake. He eyed her with cautious hope. You seem like the only one willing to fight. She zipped her bag shut. I won't let them bury this. Keep your head down. I'll do the rest. A brief smile touched his lips. Watch your back, he warned. They don't like loose ends. Ava gave a curt nod, stepping back into the corridor. Her mind buzzed with the weight of what she'd seen. Now she had the folder, and that meant she had proof of deeper corruption. She needed to move fast before Orion's upper ranks discovered the breach. A single folder of paper records was invaluable, but it wouldn't be enough on its own. She would need to cross-reference these with the digital logs they kept wiping. Tie it all together, in a way no one could ignore. Clutching the bag to her side, she headed toward an isolated staircase, determined to avoid the busier hallways. If they'd already started hacking her official accounts, they might assume she was cornered. They'd be wrong. Ava wouldn't let them crush her the same way they'd crushed others. Not now. Not with so many lives on the line. Meanwhile, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the runway, Tom Barrett convened a private strategy session with 3 key executives. The conversation crackled with tension, hushed voices betraying mounting alarm. He tapped the table, eyes scanning each face. Marcus Jefferson has been seen talking to Ava. We suspect he's passing her documents. Richard Moore, arms folded tight, grimaced. That mechanic's always been a thorn in our side. Couldn't keep his mouth shut about those 777X issues. One of the executives cleared his throat. So how do we contain this? If she's gathering physical records, it won't matter if we wipe her email or freeze her login credentials. Barrett's jaw tightened. We need another approach. IT can only do so much. She must have realized we're onto her. Moore leaned in, voice barely above a murmur. We either neutralize her credibility or find something that forces her to back down. People talk about her military background like she's untouchable. Let's see how she handles real pressure. A flicker of unease passed among them, but no one objected. Barrett tapped his tablet. We'll accelerate the hack on her personal devices. Phones, any external drives we can trace. If she tries to share data, we'll intercept it. The executive to his left frowned. That might not be enough. She could have backups offline. Barrett exhaled sharply. Then we watch her every move. Pull flight records for any route she was assigned. Find excuses to question her judgment. Build a case that she's reckless. If we tarnish her record, she'll lose credibility if she goes public. A pained silence followed. They all understood the stakes. Atlasically compromised planes and an internal conspiracy to keep them aloft was more than a minor scandal. If Ava exposed them, Orion Airways might never recover. Moore spoke again, his gaze fixed on the tarmac below. And if that fails, he said quietly, as a Boeing 777X taxied in the distance, oblivious to the drama unfolding here. Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we do what we must. She can't bring down an entire airline by herself, unless we hand her the ammo. So no missteps, no empathy. Understood? They nodded in unison, their moral compasses overshadowed by corporate self-preservation. The plan was set. Intensify the hack, undermine Ava's reputation, eliminate any evidence before she could act. They believed they had the upper hand, armed with resources and influence. Yet, none of them realized she'd already secured physical proof from Marcus. None suspected she was a step ahead, forging alliances among flight crews who didn't want to see passengers placed at risk. None imagined the lengths she'd go to, or the courage she'd summon, to protect innocent lives and fulfill the oath she believed every pilot should uphold. As the meeting adjourned, Barrett glanced once more at the Boeing 777X rolling toward the gate. The irony was razor-sharp, a gleaming symbol of Orion's status, possibly harboring hidden failures. He turned away, determined to keep it aloft in the public eye, profits soaring, no matter the cost. But outside that conference room, Ava was already moving, documents in hand, ready to fight back. This time, Orion's attempts at secrecy wouldn't go unchallenged. She had leverage. She had names, dates, and matching anomalies. Even if they thought they'd cornered her, she'd find a way to reveal the truth. Somewhere in the corridor, a phone buzzed, footsteps echoed, and a security camera blinked red. The tension in the air felt tangible, like a thunderstorm about to break. And in that charged silence, it was clear. The real battle had just begun. Tom Barrett's office boasted an unforgiving minimalist design. White walls, a polished metal desk, and a single window overlooking the bustling runway. Ava Carter stood near that desk, her posture deceptively calm. In front of her, Barrett and Richard Moore occupied two high-backed chairs, their expressions cold. They had summoned her here in the late afternoon, sending a curt message that brooked no refusal. But she wasn't intimidated. She was prepared. Barrett leaned back, fingers steepled. "Let's not dance around this, Captain Carter. We know you've been collecting data, talking to employees in maintenance, accessing files you shouldn't." Richard Moore's gaze flicked to Ava's messenger bag, then back to her face. "You've overstepped," he added, voice low. "That could be career-ending." Ava measured her response. "I have every right to understand Orion Airways safety protocols," she said evenly, "especially when those protocols appear compromised." Barrett's mouth twitched into something resembling a smile. "Compromised. That's quite the accusation. We're simply running a business, Captain. Sometimes decisions must be made swiftly." She didn't blink. Swift decisions don't justify ignoring flagged issues, or overriding recommended repairs without thorough checks. Moore leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the desk. "It's called efficiency," he snapped. "Passengers demand on-time arrivals. Ground a plane for every minor glitch, and you have chaos. Lost revenue, a bankrupt airline." The tension in the room coiled tighter. Ava could practically feel the electricity in the air. "Minor glitches," she repeated, her tone razor-sharp. "Structural cracks, fuel line stress, engine anomalies. Hardly minor." Barrett cleared his throat. "We're not here to debate semantics, Captain Carter. We're here to find a solution." Ava raised an eyebrow. "A solution to what?" Richard exchanged a glance with Barrett. Then he drew a plain white envelope from a desk drawer. He slid it toward her. "A severance package," he said bluntly. "A generous one. Sign our non-disclosure agreement. Walk away quietly, and no one needs to know anything." She stared at the envelope, then at them. "You want to pay me off, to keep me silent." Barrett's tone softened, though the chill in his eyes remained. "We prefer the term settlement." He nudged the envelope closer. "There's a figure inside that should handle your future comfortably. You can move on to another airline, maybe start fresh. Orion can't accommodate your perspective." The meaning was clear. They saw her as a threat, a whistleblower who needed to be contained. Her lips thinned. "So, if I refuse?" Richard shrugged, feigning regret. "We'll have to recommend your immediate termination. Fraud, insubordination. The exact reason doesn't matter. You'll be blacklisted. No one hires a pilot with a record of recklessness and sabotage." Ava felt her pulse quicken. They believed they held all the cards. That fear of losing her livelihood would force her into compliance. She knew better. She thought of Marcus's warnings, the hush money settlement for the injured mechanic, the stifled reports. She thought of those 777 X-logs, flagged for major concerns, casually brushed aside. She took a breath. Recklessness, she asked quietly. Is that what we're calling anyone who cares about passenger safety? She set her messenger bag on the desk, not opening it, just letting them see she was prepared. I've flown in war zones, Mr. Barrett, Mr. Moore. I've trained captains who handle crisis after crisis. I don't scare easily. Barrett's smile thinned. No, I don't suppose you do. But try getting hired anywhere if you can't produce a clean record. We own the narrative. Moore lifted his chin. We're offering you a dignified exit. Don't be foolish. Ava's gaze swept the sterile office, the single window framing a 777X rolling across the tarmac, oblivious to the confrontation. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension settle. Let's say I don't sign. What happens when your next plane has a mid-air failure? Or your engine anomalies become public? Barrett's jaw tightened. That won't happen. We have experts who know how to handle a crisis. You, on the other hand, will be finished. Silence hung between them. Ava recognized the raw arrogance in their eyes, men who believed they were untouchable. A hush of finality hovered like an invisible countdown. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, but she ignored it. Instead, she leaned forward, matching Barrett's stare. Keep your hush money, she said. I'm not for sale. For a moment, neither man responded. Then, Richard's smirk vanished. Then we have nothing left to discuss, he muttered, scowling. Ava rose, collecting her messenger bag in one swift motion. On that, we agree, she said softly. There's nothing left to say. She turned and walked out, head held high, adrenaline coursing through her veins. They thought they'd cornered her into submission or ruin. They were wrong. Ava stepped into the hallway, heart pounding. She could still feel Barrett's and Richard's threats echoing behind her. But their plan had one fatal flaw. They assumed she hadn't already acted. She moved briskly, passing a row of offices with glass walls, revealing hushed workers hunched over terminals. A few shot her curious looks, but she ignored them. She was on a mission now. They believed they could hack her files, destroy her credibility, and banish her from the industry. Except she'd already made sure those files had gone out. She ducked into a small side lounge, out of view from the main corridor. Just last night, she'd uploaded the entire trove of maintenance overrides, suspicious repair logs, and Marcus's folder of hidden anomalies onto 2 secure cloud servers outside of Orion's reach. Then she'd emailed partial evidence to a contact at the FAA, someone she trusted, someone who owed her a favor from her military days. Now, she tapped her phone, checking for any response. A single notification. Data received. FAA is reviewing. Her chest tightened with a cautious surge of relief. If Barrett and Richard attempted to bury the evidence, they'd be too late. The FAA already had the core pieces needed to initiate an investigation. She glanced around the lounge, ensuring no cameras were focused on her. Satisfied, she closed out the message. Her heart still raced, remembering the envelope full of hush money. The memory seared her nerves. These men were willing to pay a fortune just to silence her. That fact alone spoke volumes about how far the rot went. A door opened from across the lounge. James Lee, face etched with concern, slipped inside. They blocked your company email, he whispered, voice hoarse. Said you're under review for behavioral discrepancies. People are talking, it's bad. She exhaled slowly, not surprised. I just told Barrett I'm not backing down. James's eyes widened. So you've confronted them. They'll try to spin it that you're unfit, emotional, reckless. Captain Whitmore's already in a briefing, dropping hints that you're unreliable. Ava gritted her teeth. Let them. I'm not alone in this. If the FAA steps in, they can't bury what we found. James nodded, relief flickering across his face. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, grimacing. They're calling me to the training center. Probably want to grill me about you. His hesitation was palpable. Ava rested a hand on his shoulder. Tell the truth. If they threaten you, remember, their power is built on fear. Once that cracks, they lose. He nodded, a silent thank you in his eyes, then slipped out. She waited until the door clicked behind him before stepping back into the hallway. Each step echoed in her ears. She passed a maintenance schedule pinned to a bulletin board, noticing more suspicious gaps in the logs. The corruption ran deeper than she'd feared, but it only strengthened her resolve. Rounding a corner, she nearly collided with a stern-faced security guard who gave her a cursory glance. He didn't speak, but the tension in his gaze said enough. He was watching her, likely under direct orders from Barrett or Richard. She forced a polite nod and continued on, refusing to show apprehension. At the end of the corridor, she reached the elevator that led to the main lobby. She pressed the button, her mind whirling with everything that had happened over the past hours. Discovering the falsified logs, meeting Marcus, facing Barrett. They must have believed she would crumble under the threat of blacklisting. The elevator chimed open. She stepped inside alone, letting the doors slide shut with a hush. As it descended, she allowed herself a brief moment to consider the magnitude of her actions. Exposing Orion Airways could topple a giant. It could also ruin her financially, even personally. But the choice had been made long ago. She'd be complicit if she let it slide. The doors opened to the lobby, a sprawling space filled with travelers and employees crisscrossing under bright overhead lights. Ava stepped out, scanning the crowd, feeling a surge of determination. The fight wasn't over. Barrett and Richard would try more desperate measures, but she had anticipated this. She walked past a row of check-in counters, where smiling agents assisted passengers blissfully unaware of the turbulence rumbling beneath Orion's polished surface. A child tugged on his mother's sleeve, excited for a vacation flight, while an elderly couple listened to an attendant's instructions. This was who she was protecting, ordinary people trusting that their flight would be safe. Once outside, Ava paused on the curb, the swirl of traffic and the roar of jet engines in the distance. She glanced at her phone again, checking the time. If the FAA acted swiftly, they'd demand immediate inspection, maybe even ground certain planes. The public would soon learn the truth. She lifted her chin, inhaling the crisp air. They thought they had cornered her, forced her into a final confrontation in that sleek office. They couldn't have guessed she was already 3 moves ahead. Stepping aside, she ordered a rideshare. She'd spent enough time in the belly of Orion's headquarters for one day. Now it was time for them to realize just how thoroughly she'd undercut their scheme. A text from Marcus lit up her screen. Heard Barrett's in a panic. They're locking down everything. Be safe. She typed a short reply. Too late. Files are sent. Thank you. That final realization settled over her. She had turned the tables. They believed they still controlled the board. She knew otherwise. As she slipped her phone away, she recalled the look on Barrett's face when he'd tried to buy her silence. She let herself smile. They thought their threats ended the war. They had no idea it had only just begun. The official FAA notice arrived at Orion Airways headquarters just after dawn, carried by a wide-eyed administrative assistant clutching a sealed envelope. She delivered it to the executive floor with trembling hands, unsure of the document's contents but sensing its weight. Inside Tom Barrett's office, the atmosphere shifted from usual corporate hush to an uneasy silence the moment he tore open the envelope. He skimmed the first lines, his brow tightening with every word. Certificate suspension jumped out at him like a warning flare in a night sky. Richard Moore stood beside him, arms crossed, scanning the same page. Both men exchanged a look of raw alarm. This was no gentle inquiry or routine audit. It was an immediate grounding order for Orion's entire fleet. Downstairs, an ominous chain reaction began. Departures halted, gates locked, and flight status boards flickered from on time to canceled. Passengers wandered the terminal in confusion, demanding explanations from staff who had none to give. Pilots, some already in pre-flight checks, received abrupt messages to power down and stand by for updates. Rumors spread, from an internal whistleblower to a major safety scandal. Ava Carter watched from a second-floor balcony that overlooked the main atrium. She saw the lines at customer service counters grow, heard the rising cadence of restless voices. Though she felt relief that Orion's unsafe practices were finally exposed, she also recognized the chaos unfolding below. Families missed connections, business travelers fumed, and employees faced the looming threat of job loss. This was the cost of sweeping negligence under a rug for too long. Word reached the crew lounge. The FAA had sent investigators to seal off maintenance records, question supervisors, and review every suspicious log. Tension spiked in every corner. Some employees whispered about possible jail time for top execs. Others frantically tried to salvage their personal reputations, distancing themselves from any wrongdoing. Barrett and Moore convened an emergency meeting on the top floor, pulling in department heads who arrived flushed and breathless. With the FAA demanding full compliance, Orion's normal swagger vanished. The men who once gave Ava condescending half-smiles now wore expressions of defeat. A fierce desperation permeated their whispered conversations. How to spin this? How to blame isolated oversights? How to protect the company's crumbling image? Ava turned away from the railing, phone buzzing with messages from supportive colleagues. James Lee texted, "Barrett's panicking. Everyone's locked out of systems. They're trying to figure out who fed FAA the info." She couldn't help a wry smile, recalling the hush money bribe she'd refused only hours ago. They'd underestimated her resolve, and it led them here. In the hallway, she caught a glimpse of two FAA agents striding toward a conference room, briefcases in hand, expressions resolute. If Orion had believed it could dodge accountability indefinitely, those illusions were now shattered. License suspended, planes grounded. This was the beginning of the reckoning Ava had risked everything to set in motion. Tom Barrett paced the length of a borrowed conference room on the 10th floor, windows revealing nothing but the foggy morning skyline. Overhead, fluorescence buzzed with a harsh glow. Richard Moore sat at the table, hunched over a stack of documents, his face drawn and pale. The clamor from outside, footsteps, urgent voices, ringing phones, mirrored the panic roiling inside them. They had to find a way out of this spiral. Fast. "Damn it," Barrett hissed, slamming a fist onto the table. "The FAA's not just issuing fines. They're threatening to revoke our license entirely." He looked at Richard, who rubbed his temples in silent dread. "We need to stop this before the press runs wild. Our stocks are tanking by the minute." Richard's gaze flicked toward the door, half expecting an investigator to burst in. "This is Carter's doing," he muttered, voice laced with bitterness. "Without her meddling, none of this would have escalated. We could have fixed the minor issues quietly." "Minor issues?" Barrett snapped, eyes flashing. "We falsified reports on critical aircraft systems. That's not exactly a small oversight. And it's not just Carter. She's rallied a few others, James Lee, maybe that mechanic Marcus. They're all feeding evidence to the FAA." Richard exhaled shakily. "We can't change what they've sent, but maybe we can shut Carter up again. She turned down the severance offer, but if we sweeten the deal, or threaten harder—" A sharp knock interrupted him. One of Barrett's assistants peeked in, face tense. "Captain Carter's outside. She agreed to a meeting." Barrett and Richard exchanged a grim look. "Bring her in," Barrett ordered. He tried to steal his composure, smoothing the wrinkles from his shirt, as the assistant guided Ava inside. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You wanted to talk?" she asked, crossing her arms. Her gaze flicked to Richard, who couldn't hold eye contact for more than a second. Barrett cleared his throat. "We realize the situation has escalated," he began, feigning a calm he didn't feel. Neither side wants a total collapse of Orion Airways. There are thousands of jobs at stake. He paused, gauging her reaction. We're willing to renegotiate your settlement, a far larger figure. Plus, we'll rescind your termination and publicly absolve you of wrongdoing. Ava's eyes narrowed. And in exchange, I dropped the FAA complaint. Richard hurriedly nodded. Correct. You'll also sign a statement saying the earlier logs were misunderstandings, not deliberate negligence. She stared at them, letting the tension settle like a heavy weight in the room. Outside the glass panel, employees scurried in tense confusion, completely unaware of the conversation that might determine the fate of an entire airline. Ava pictured the shady repair logs, the near accidents, and the hush money offered to silence dissent. You think I care about your hush money now? She asked quietly. You're under federal investigation. The FAA has your number, and the media is circling. No settlement can fix the truth. Her voice had an unyielding edge that made Barrett flinch. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words died in his throat. Moore tried a last-ditch appeal. Look, you're a pilot. You know what it means to keep an airline running. If Orion goes under, we lose everything. I'm sure we can find a middle ground, some arrangement. He trailed off, watching her expression remain unchanged, like granite. No, Ava said, her tone final. I won't be a party to lies. You've endangered lives. If the FAA's grounding us, it's because you brought this on yourselves. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. I won't stop telling the truth. Richard inhaled sharply, panic etched across his face. Barrett looked like he wanted to argue further, but remained silent. Her footsteps echoed as she walked out, leaving them behind in a room that felt suddenly suffocating. They had no leverage left, nothing to placate her or undo the damage. The moment Ava's silhouette disappeared from the doorway, Barrett cursed under his breath. She'd refused them again, and the clock was ticking down faster than ever. If they couldn't bend her will, Orion's days were numbered. The official word spread rapidly. FAA investigators found sufficient grounds to suspend Orion's operating certificate. Multiple news outlets broke the story, detailing how months, even years, of ignored safety protocols led to this moment. Shareholders panicked, trying to offload stocks before the market closed. Employees huddled in small groups, some in tears, others furiously updating their resumes. In the center of it all stood Ava Carter. She'd become an unexpected focal point for journalists camped outside Orion's main building. Microphones thrust in her face, cameras blinking. She gave only minimal statements. Safety must never be compromised. Or, I did what any responsible pilot would do. That was enough for the headlines to write themselves. By mid-afternoon, financial analysts were calling Orion's fate dire. The airline's board of directors convened a last-ditch emergency session. Word leaked that they were considering bankruptcy protection. Barrett and Richard, once so confident, found themselves isolated. Board members who had once praised them for efficient operations now demanded answers about faked maintenance logs and pilot intimidation. Behind the scenes, Barrett tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, attempting to salvage some fragment of control. But the data Ava provided was undeniable. Every forged signature, every overridden red flag, every hush money payout was meticulously documented. FAA officials announced that if these allegations proved true, criminal charges could follow. That evening, the skyline outside Orion's headquarters flickered with media vans and bright floodlights. Journalists reported live while security guards struggled to maintain order. Inside, offices were being emptied of sensitive files, accountants rummaging through financial statements, legal teams crafting statements they hoped might stave off total collapse. Ava, finishing a final interview with an aviation journalist, passed by the deserted corridor leading to the executive wing. The door to Barrett's corner office stood ajar. She glimpsed him, hunched at his desk, face buried in his hands, while Richard Moore stood by the window, staring at the city lights. It was a tableau of defeat, a moment that crystallized the unraveling of all their bluster. She didn't linger. There was no glee in seeing them like that, only a sober reminder that actions had consequences. She collected her things from her old locker in the crew lounge, where a handful of pilots watched her quietly, some nodding in respect, others still unsure how to feel. She gave them a tight smile. By morning, Orion Airways filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, the once proud airline now crippled by federal sanctions and public outrage. Television anchors debated whether the company could ever recover, or if it would be dissected by larger carriers. Ava listened to the broadcasts with a calm acceptance, remembering every belittling remark, every conversation she'd had with Marcus and James, every time she was told to wait outside. Walking out of the building for the last time, she paused briefly at the glass doors, the reflection of Orion's grand logo looming behind her. The same brand that tried to bury her now faced its own burial. She stepped into the brisk evening air. A text arrived from James. "We did it." She typed back, "No, we did what was right." Pocketing her phone, Ava headed toward her car, shoulders squared, relief mingling with exhaustion. They'd asked her to sacrifice integrity for profit. She refused. The old empire had collapsed, and she'd emerged with her principles intact. At daybreak, the remnants of Orion Airways existed only as scattered headlines and deserted offices. Ava Carter, stepping away from the turmoil, paused near the airport's observation deck, where quiet replaced the clamor of corporate downfall. She had refused every hush payment, every last-minute settlement, standing firm on the conviction that safety outweighed profit. An email alert chimed on her phone. A fresh job offer from Horizon Skies, a competitor seeking a pilot with integrity. She read the details, lips curving into a thoughtful smile. They offered generous terms, but what caught her eye most was their pledge to prioritize transparent maintenance and fair treatment of staff, a culture Orion had failed to uphold. As she turned to go, a timid voice called out behind her. A young woman in a crisp pilot's uniform approached, barely 22 by the look of her wings. She swallowed nervously, then spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, I didn't give up my dream of flying." Ava's chest tightened at the quiet gratitude shining in the woman's eyes. This was the reason she fought. Not for glory, but for the next generation who deserved an industry built on honesty and respect. She gently placed a hand on the young pilot's shoulder. "Keep flying," she said softly. The woman nodded, tears brightening her gaze, then walked away, shoulders straighter than before. Ava watched her disappear into the crowd, realizing just how profound one voice could be when raised against injustice. She lifted her gaze to the sky overhead, where planes still soared in distant arcs. As the morning sun gilded the horizon, she murmured, "The sky has no boundaries. It belongs to all of us." With her mind set on the future, Ava Carter walked away, certain this triumph was the beginning.